So far we have seen a couple of basic Docker commands. We have seen Docker pull, which pulls the image from the repository to local environment. We also saw run, which basically combines Docker pull and Docker start, pulls the image if it's not locally available, and then starts it right away. Then we saw Docker start and Docker stop, which makes it possible to restart a container if you need to. We also saw Docker run with options. The one option that we saw was -D, which is detach. So you can run the container in detached mode, so you can use terminal again. -P allows you to bind port of your host to the container. So very important to remember -P. Then comes the port of your host, and then comes the port of your container, whatever it might be. We also saw Docker PS -A, which basically gives you all the containers, no matter if they're running currently or not. We also saw Docker images, which gives you all the images that you have locally. So for example, if after a couple of months you decide to clean up your space and get rid of some stale images, you can actually check the list and then go through them and delete them. You can do the same with stale Docker containers that you don't use anymore or you don't need anymore. You can also get rid of them. So the final part of the Docker basic commands are commands for troubleshooting, which are very, very useful. If something goes wrong in the container, you want to see the logs of the container, or you want to actually get inside of container, get the terminal and execute some commands on it. So let's see Docker PS. We have 2 containers running, right? Now we don't have any output. We don't see any logs here. So let's say something happens, your application cannot connect to Redis and you don't know what's happening. So ideally you would want to see what logs Redis container is producing, right? The way to do that is very easy. You just say Docker logs and you specify the container ID and you see the logs. You can also do the Docker logs if you don't want to remember the container ID or do Docker PS all the time. You can remember the name of the container and you can get the logs using the name. So a little side note here, as we're talking about the names of the containers. So here, as you see, when a container is created, you just get some random name like this. So you can name your containers as you want using another option of the Docker run, which might be pretty useful sometimes if you don't want to work with the container IDs and you just want to remember the names, or if you just want to differentiate between the containers. So for example, let's create a new container from Redis using a different name that we choose. So I'm gonna stop this container and I'm going to create a new one from the same image. So let's run it in the detached mode. Let's open the port 1001.2.6.3.7.9 and give the name to the container. And since it's the older version, let's call it Redis older. And we need to specify the image. So remember, this will create a new container since we're running the Docker run command again. So if we execute this and check again, we see container is created, which is fresh new. You can see it created, and the name is Redis older. And we can do the same for the other container, so that we kind of know which container is what. So I'll stop this one. And I will use the same command here. And I will call this Redis latest. And since we bind another port, so I'm gonna run it and let's see. So here I have 2 containers running. Now I know Redis older, Redis latest. So another very useful command in debugging is docker exec. So what we can do with docker exec is we can actually get the terminal of a running container. So let's check again. We have 2 containers running, and let's say there is some problem with the latest Redis latest container, and I want to get a terminal of that container and to maybe navigate a directory inside, check the log file, or maybe check the configuration file, or print out the environmental variables, whatever. So in order to do that, we use docker exec command with -it, which stands for interactive terminal. Then I specify the container ID, and I say in bash, so I get the bash. And here you see that the cursor changed. So I'm inside of the container as a root user. And here, if I say ls, okay, the date is empty. I can also print out in which directory I am. I can go to the home directory, see what's there. So I have my virtual file system inside of a container. And here I can navigate the different directories and I can check stuff. I can also print all the environmental variables to see that something is set correctly and do all kinds of stuff here. And this could be really useful if you have a container with some complex configuration, or if, for example, you're running your own application that you wrote in a container and you have some complex configuration there or some kind of setup and you want to validate that everything is correctly set. In order to exit the terminal, you just do exit and you're out. You can also do the same using the name. Again, if you don't want to work with the IDs and you just want to remember the names of the container to make it easier, you can do it with the name as well. Same thing. Since most of the container images are based on some lightweight Linux distributions, you wouldn't have much of the Linux commands or applications installed here. For example, you wouldn't have curl or some other stuff. So you are a little bit more limited in that sense. So you can't execute a lot of stuff from the Docker containers. For most of the debugging work, it should be actually enough. So the final part to review the difference between Docker run and Docker start, which might be confusing for some people. Let's revisit them. So basically Docker run is where you create a new container from an image. So Docker run will take an image with a specific version or just latest, right, as option or as an attribute. With Docker start, you're not working with images, but rather with containers. So for example, as we saw, Docker run has a lot of options. You specify with -d and -p the port binding, and then you have this name of the container and all this stuff. So basically you tell Docker at the beginning what kind of container with what attributes, name, and so on to create from a specific image. But once the container is created, and you can see that using the command. So for example, here, the last ones that we created. And if you stop it and you want to restart it, you just need to use the command docker start and specify the container ID. And when you start it, the container will retain all the attributes that we defined when creating the container using Docker run. So Docker run is to create a new container. Docker start is to restart a stopped container.